much information do we consume?
I wrote this book in the first place to solve the problem of information overload. This classic issue that we've been hearing about now for 20 years and yet still have not found a solution. Too much information, too many emails, too many messages, too many things to do, too many things to remember. So it's a solution to the fact that we are trying to run complex modern lives, trying to take in and make sense of more information than ever on brains that haven't changed biologically in 200,000 years. Now, as I went about solving that problem over time, I started to realize, this wasn't just a solution to one problem. It was actually this, what I sometimes call cognitive system, this cognitive exoskeleton, this system that people could use and are using to create better work, to make better decisions, to be more productive, to save time. And so it started as the solution to a problem, and over time became kind of this entire methodology of how to do creative work in an environment of information abundance. It's really difficult to wrap your head around just how much information we intake every day. It's really kind of staggering. If you were going to try to quantify how much information the average modern human, the average knowledge worker, just consumes, just takes in, it depends how you measure it, but a couple of the most staggering statistics are that if you measured it almost like as if it was on a computer, it would come out to over 30 gigabytes. 30 gigabytes. That's like a solid size hard drive that is coming into your 5 senses each and every day. By another measure, it was the equivalent of 174 newspapers. Imagine waking up every morning and reading 174 newspapers from front to back. Well, you don't have to imagine it, you do. That is literally what you do each and every day when you look at the emails you receive, the messages you receive, the sights and sounds, the audio in podcasts, audiobooks, the reading you do, the communication you do. It is truly an inhuman amount of data, which is why we are in the situation that we're in now. There's an economist, his name was Herbert Simon in the mid-20th century, and he has this quote that I think really sheds light on what is going on here, which is, he says, an abundance of information creates a poverty of attention. Right? The more and more information that we have the option of attending to, the more that consumes a certain resource. The resource it consumes is attention. And that's an issue because as a resource, attention is incredibly scarce. It's even more scarce than time, right? In a day you have 24 hours, but that doesn't mean you have 24 hours of attention. In fact, many days might be so chaotic and frenetic, you might have zero attention. The whole day might just be putting out fires and running from one thing to the next. And so attention is our most rare and therefore precious attention, and it's what's being consumed by all of these companies and apps and social media platforms that consume it. That's what they're after, right? Even more important, even more valuable to them than the dollars in your pocket is your attention. That is the very fuel of the internet, the fuel of the modern economy. They're going for engagement. Engagement is the currency of the modern world. And if you want to avoid giving away all of that attention to everyone who asks for it, every company that demands it, you have to kind of step back and create a bit of a filter. You really have to create a buffer between what I sometimes think of as the media storm, this constant tempest of information. Step back into your little cottage and ask, what do I really want to let in here? What actually makes my life better? What actually makes me healthier? What makes me wiser? Because if you just take in what all of these platforms think you should take in, I can guarantee you that is not going to naturally make you healthier and happier and wiser.
Why did history's great minds keep commonplace books?
I started researching. I wonder if anyone else in the past ever had this problem. We can't be the first people to ever have too much information to manage. So I went back through history at different stages when there was a lot of change, when society was changing, the economy was changing, the way that we lived was changing. Went back to the Industrial Revolution, to the Enlightenment, to the Renaissance. And it turned out throughout history again and again, every time humanity faced too much change and too much information going on around them, they turned to the same solution. They turned to this solution, this thing called a commonplace book. The word commonplace actually goes all the way back to ancient Greek times, when the ancient Greek assemblies needed a common place, a centralized place to keep all the information that they needed to manage their democracy. But again and again, most recently in the Industrial Revolution in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, people would keep a notebook, a paper, almost like a journal, except it wasn't just like a diary. It wasn't just a place for them to pour out their, personal thoughts and reflections. It was a place for them to keep a much wider variety of things, quotes and Bible verses and recipes and bits of advice and wisdom. They would even put, a leaf that they found in the garden, or later on a photograph. It became this central repository of all the information and content that was meaningful to them. Some of history's greatest figures. Leonardo da Vinci is very well known for having, I think, around a dozen different notebooks that documented an entire lifetime of learning and discovery and research. Later on was John Locke, the English philosopher, who actually was so passionate about commonplace books. Later in his life, he published a book on how to make commonplace books. One of the few examples of that we have. And then more recently, well-known authors, science fiction authors like Octavia Butler, used it to research their characters and the science that went into the science fiction. Really, it's kind of a who's who of characters going back in time. Sometimes they didn't give us that many details. They didn't talk that much about it. They would just make these small little references to it. But I would dare to say that most of the most prolific and impactful artists, writers, poets, musicians throughout history had some kind of book or note-taking system that was their place to develop their work in process before it was ready for publication. And that's how it was so good by the time that it was ready to be shared. And the reason that was so effective is, most information that we have access to comes from some outside authority. It's a school or it's a corporation telling us what's important. Well, a commonplace book is the one place where you control the narrative. You decide what goes in and what doesn't. You decide what it means. It's the one place you control, and you can make sense of all the stuff happening around you. And what I'm trying to do essentially is reinvent that age-old practice in digital form for modern lives and modern work. So we have this very clear historical precedent, but there's one big difference between Leonardo da Vinci and John Locke and Octavia Butler and us, which is that these people were full-time creatives. They were artists. They could dedicate all of their time to taking notes and reading and writing poetry and, sketching and drawing. I don't know about you, but I can't afford to spend 100% of my time in kind of creative ideation. My work is creative. As a knowledge worker, I have to solve, creative problems, but it has to be done productively. It has to be done efficiently. It has to be done in just a few minutes at a time, in the in-between spaces of phone calls and meetings and my tasks and to-dos and projects. So what that means for us is it has to be about what modern technology allows us to do. First of all, we keep a world-class note-taking device called a smartphone with us almost 24/7. We don't have to scramble and look for a piece of paper or a notebook and a pen. We always have that thing with us. We can save not only text, we can save photographs, we can save links, attachments, GIFs, videos, almost any kind of media, not just handwriting. And third, and maybe most importantly, we have this just incredible tool called search. You can organize your notes, and I have a few ways of doing that, but it doesn't have to be the most precise, rigid, formulaic way of organizing your notes. It can be a little loose and carefree because you have the incredible power of search to find anything you need, anything you've ever saved or taken note of in the future.
What is the code framework?
A search engine. Anything that you can find on Google has no competitive advantage to knowing it. because everyone else in the world has access to it, right? You don't need to write those things down. The stuff on the internet doesn't need to be saved. But now think about the knowledge and the wisdom that is created out of your life experiences. If you've ever lost a job or had a failure or a disappointment, there are certain lessons, certain bits of, I would say, wisdom that sunk into almost your soul. Life lessons and little bits of perspective that even if you told them to someone else, it might not make sense to them. It only makes sense to you because it's in the context of your personal experience. Think about failures and mistakes, but also successes you've had. What did you learn from victories? What did you learn about what works? What did you learn about what is needed for you to do your best work? Both the negative stuff and the positive stuff, as long as it comes from your personal life experience. That's knowledge that no one else in the world has access to or doesn't mean the same thing to them. That's the kind of stuff that you want to write in your notes and revisit over time because it really reveals things to you about who you are. And finally, the fourth criteria is things that are surprising. Think about this for a sec. If you read something in a book and it doesn't surprise you, there's no reason to highlight it or write it down. Because if it didn't surprise you, that means you already knew it at some level. And if you already knew it, then why write it down? A great barometer for the things that are worth saving is things that surprise you. Things that are genuinely novel, things that you never encountered before. You never thought about it quite that way before. Often these are things whose meaning is initially unclear. You might read a quote in a book and you might even disagree with it. You might even say, actually, I think this is wrong, but it evokes something in me. It surprises me. It makes my mind kind of perk up and pay attention. That is a great example of things you should save in your second brain, because often what that is your subconscious telling you there's something here. There's something valuable or important or something relevant to you, even before your logical mind knows what's going on. You can listen to those subconscious kind of decisions by noticing what surprises you and capturing that. I always think about a term from information theory, which is called the signal in the noise. Okay, now think about this. Anytime let's say you're listening to a radio program, there's a lot of noise. There's the background static, maybe there's sounds in the background, there's ums and ahs, all this data that just doesn't matter, that makes no difference. But there's also a signal. In that case, listening to a radio program, the signal is the words coming out of the guest's or the host's mouth. As long as you can hear what they're saying, all the background noise doesn't matter. Now, think about how that applies to the rest of your life. There's always noise and there's always a signal. Let's say you're reading a book. Not every single idea in a book is equally valuable. It's kind of obvious, isn't it? Not every claim or statistic or fact that the author cites is equally important. If you're listening to a podcast, not every answer that the guest being interviewed has is equally valuable. Now apply this to everything. A class you take, a seminar you attend, a conference you go to, a meeting you have with a colleague or your boss. Don't tell them this, but not every single word, not every single minute in that entire meeting is equally valuable. So what does that mean? It means that it really falls to you. It falls to you the responsibility of finding the signal in the noise. I often notice that I'll read a book or read an article or listen to an audiobook and write down just a few things. Like 3 to 5 bullet points is probably a typical amount of notes that I'll take. And what that represents is me reaching in, ignoring 95%, 98%, maybe even 99% of that content and extracting the signal that is most relevant to me, which, by the way, might not be the same for everyone. You might have a different signal listening to the same piece of content or reading the same piece of content, which is why we have to do this for ourselves. We have to take responsibility and agency for our own information stream and decide the bits of information that are most relevant to us based on our projects, our goals, our priorities in life. I'm a big fan of Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winning theoretical physicist who also had many other endeavors that he was into. And I always wondered, I think the thing that most impressed me was how eclectic his interests were. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics. That's a pretty good resume. But then he also published multiple best-selling books. He traveled around the world lecturing on physics to all sorts of universities and institutions. He even played the bongo and the conga drums in orchestras. I mean, this is someone who went really deep on one thing, which was physics, but that didn't mean he didn't have a very eclectic and varied life. He really had both, the best of both worlds. So I started reading. I read all his books, still didn't find the secret, and then I started reading his biographies. And there was one interview that he did that gave me just a little clue, one little clue as to how he did it. And what he said is that the way he did research was by keeping in mind what he called his favorite problems. These were essentially open questions, these ongoing open questions that he had about physics, but also about many other scientific fields and even other subjects. And he would keep in mind these open questions, things like, how do you make a diagram of an electron? Things like, how do you teach physics to an audience of young people? Things like, what makes a successful marriage? Once he had these open questions in mind, he just lived an interesting life. He he read papers that he was interested in. And what he would do is every time he came across an interesting scientific study or an interesting technique or an interesting takeaway, he would just ask himself in the back of his mind, does this have any application to one of my favorite problems? Is there any open question that I already have that this answer, that this solution that I'm looking at can just be applied to? And it's kind of a random way for matches between questions and answers, problems and solutions. And most of the time there wouldn't be a fit. Most of the time the answer was nothing. But once in a while, this kind of open-ended way of working would yield fruit because he would make connections across domains. He would find a connection between a problem in one field and an answer in another field that no one had thought of. And in that moment, they would call him a genius. They would be amazed that he could ever see such a connection. So the relationship that has to our own work, often we're answering the same kinds of problems, the same kinds of questions over time. Let's say you're a web designer. You might have the open question, how do I design the header of a website that grabs people's attention? Right? That is a problem that you are paid to solve again and again and again over time. And there's no one answer. There's no definitive solution, but you can collect answers. You can collect examples, collect case studies. Every single time you see a banner or a header that is good or is effective or gives you an idea, you save it. And that becomes this kind of, it's like this file of examples, this file of case studies. So when the moment comes to create your own website, you're not just trying to think about something, out of the blue. You're going back to your archive of examples and pulling from things that have worked in the past, pulling from and borrowing from the work of others. The key is you have to give yourself permission to use any kind of open question. You might only have a few kind of big picture, very philosophical, conceptual questions, but some of my favorite ones are things like, how do I exercise every day? Things like, how do I spend time with my kids in a way that also gives us exercise? Things like, how do I spend quality time with my wife when we have a kid and a second one on the way? They're almost like, many people would say, mundane, maybe kind of boring, everyday problems, right? They're not these grand philosophical things. I really like to mix them. I'll have a conceptual question right next to a business question, right next to a personal question, right next to a psychology question, right next to a home maintenance question. With this mix of questions with different aspects and different areas of my life, no matter what mood I'm in or how much energy I have or how I feel, I can just turn my attention to different aspects of my life or my work, and I always have an interesting avenue to explore.
What are the benefits and limitations of capturing?
It's really incredible. I started researching this and I found that there are just so many benefits to writing things down. Just that simple act of getting these thoughts and ideas and feelings, which are often kind of these vague, jumbled up notions in our head, and externalizing them, offloading them from our minds into some external medium, whether that's paper or software, has benefits for your peace of mind. It has actual health benefits. There's been studies that have shown that your blood pressure will be lower, you'll have less anxiety, you'll live longer. I mean, these kinds of things, if there was a magic pill that promised these benefits, you'd be like, give it to me. I don't care what it costs. And I'm telling you, you can access these benefits for free right now with nothing more than a paper and pencil or a note-taking app. All you have to do is get those off your brain. No one has to read what you write down. You don't even have to revisit it. You get most of the benefits just in that instantaneous moment of writing things down. Now, my work is all about first getting the benefits of writing things down, but also getting a second round of benefits, which is the benefits of retrieving and recalling and reviewing. So I really think you can get the benefits twice. But it's important to realize that as soon as you begin writing down, right in that moment, you are starting to feel more relief, you're starting to feel less stress, and your body, in a very real sense, your body and your mind are letting go. They're letting go of having to constantly have those thoughts cycling around your head again and again, because you know it's in some external place that it can be revisited if you ever need it. Let's talk about the limits of digital note-taking for a second, which could illuminate what they are.
Совсем безмозглый трейлер. Ну, здесь обгонять, я вообще не знаю, каким надо быть отморозком. Слов нет просто.